Gracias por su asistencia. Vamos a dar inicio a la mesa número 4, que lleva por título Culturas mexicanas y chicanas en Estados Unidos. En esta mesa nos acompañan 3 expositores. En primer lugar tenemos al doctor Charles Tatum, de la Universidad de Arizona. Lo voy a presentar antes de darle la palabra. Él es profesor emérito de lengua española por la Universidad de Arizona. Ha publicado ampliamente sobre ficción y narrativa latinoamericana, además de editar y coeditar varios libros sobre la literatura chicana en la cultura popular. Es asesor del proyecto sobre la recuperación de la herencia literaria de habla hispana y editor de la Enciclopedia de Cultura Latina 2013. Entonces, sin más, le damos la palabra al doctor Charles, por favor.
Bueno, gracias. Primero quisiera agradecerles a los organizadores del Colegio por este estupendo foro, con un agradecimiento especial al doctor José Manuel Valenzuela y a nuestra infatigable Gabriela Zamora, que gracias a su paciencia y a su generosidad. Gracias, Gabriela, no se ve hoy entre nosotros. Creo que está descansando, ¿no? Después de tanto. Con el otro grupo. Mis comentarios esta mañana vienen de una larga introducción a una propuesta de antología sobre la cultura popular chicana. Aunque no está entre nosotros, quisiera señalar que nuestro colega David Maciel fue por algunos meses el que coordinaba y guiaba el ambicioso proyecto de producir varias antologías sobre el florecimiento chicano. Gracias, David. Voy a hacer mis comentarios en inglés, puesto que la gran mayoría de las citas que incluyo de varios teóricos y críticos chicanos se publicaron originalmente en inglés. Me van a perdonar eso, ¿no? Quisiera decirles que con un apellido como Tatum o Tatum, ¿qué estoy haciendo aquí? Pues la familia de mi mamá es de ascendencia mexicana, ¿no? Nací en El Paso y pasé toda mi niñez y parte de mi adolescencia en Parral, Chihuahua. Cuando era estudiante de posgrado en Stanford, empezando en 1966, empecé ese proceso de concientización política, empezando con mi participación con muchos otros en los boicoteos que habían organizado Dolores Huerta, César Chávez en ese entonces. Mi interés en lo chicano empezó en ese momento y como estudiante doctoral en la Universidad de Nuevo México empecé mis estudios de lo que era en ese entonces pues los inicios del florecimiento chicano. Recuerdo cuando venían varios poetas a declamar en Albuquerque, donde era estudiante de posgrado, especialmente alurista. Me quedé muy emocionado con esa presentación poética, ese performance poético de alurista. Mis intereses en la cultura popular chicana y latinoamericana también empezaron en ese momento, y en 1980, unos 15 años más tarde, con mi colega historiador Harold Hines, empezamos una revista que titulamos Studies in Latin American Popular Literature, que se sigue publicando, que ahora la prensa de la Universidad de Texas la publica. Entonces, mis comentarios en inglés. Y quiero asegurarles que al fin, claro, estoy dispuesto a participar en la discusión y las preguntas en español. Chicanas and Chicanos have a long history of resisting domination by and assimilation into mainstream Anglo society. Among the many strategies we have employed are the popular culture practices, popular culture practices. These practices have not remained static, but have evolved over time since 1848 as they have been adapted to address new threats and rapid changes in U.S. society. Changes such as a progressively more virulent reactionary response to the dramatic increase in the population of Chicanos and the increasingly greater political power that this segment of the U.S. electorate poses. The backlash against undocumented immigrants has also fueled greater attempts to stunt the political impact of Chicanos as state legislators across the country have put into place voter suppression measures. Popular culture practices have also been adapted to technological advances that have presented both an opportunity and a threat. In the next few moments, I would like to present a summary of how prominent Chicana and Chicano scholars have employed innovative approaches to the sometimes vexing concept of popular culture in general, as well as some of the specific practices, cultural practices that have historically formed the basis of resistance. We are all familiar with two dominant views of the production and consumption of popular culture. The first is goes like this. It is imposed by powerful forces of domination from above and upon the social classes with subordinate political and economic status. And the second, it is produced by and for subordinated people themselves. We know that the first view is supported by mass culture theorists based on the concepts developed by progressive German intellectuals such as Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who came together at the University of Frankfurt Institute of Social Research in the 1920s and 1930s. They focused on developing critical theory and research aimed at revealing the social contradictions underlying the emergent capitalist societies of the time. Their objective was to contrast theoretical critiques of modern capitalism, especially monopoly consumer capitalism in Europe and later in the United States. For the Frankfurt School in general and for Adorno in particular, the concept of commodity fetishism is the basis of a theory of how cultural forms such as popular music can serve, quote, to secure the continuing economic, political, and ideological domination of capitalism, end quote. Adorno believed that culture is something which is imposed upon the masses that they accept, although not always consciously welcoming its imposition. He warns that to not recognize and oppose the nature of the culture industry that is corrupting and manipulative is to succumb to its ideology. If consumers are passive, he says, they accept the frequently nefarious forces of the capitalist order that stands behind the culture industry to discourage questioning and opposing its false needs and false solutions. Over time, he believed, consumers had become completely powerless to accepting the dictates of the culture industry that encourages conformity and consensus. Quote, the customer is not king, as the culture industry would have us believe, not its subject, but its object, end quote. Closely related to the Frankfurt School's conceptualization of popular culture as mass culture is that of other thinkers such as Althusser and Gramsci. Gramsci defines hegemony as, quote, a cultural and ideological means whereby the dominant groups in society, including fundamentally but not exclusively the ruling class, maintain their dominance by securing the spontaneous consent, in quotes, spontaneous consent of subordinate groups, including the working class. This is achieved by the negotiated construction of a political and ideological consensus which incorporates both dominant and dominated groups, end quote. Gramsci, however, departs from the rigidity of the Frankfurt School and its successors and that he does not view the culture industry as completely dominating the choices and tastes of subordinate consumers who mindlessly accept the ideas embedded in what is produced for their consumption in a top-down way. On the other hand, his concept of hegemony does not completely allow consumers of mass or popular culture to be completely independent and autonomous of the images, messages, etc., that the culture industry produces for them. Other theorists, commonly referred to as cultural populists, tend to define popular culture as the ways in which consumers receive the messages sent to them by culture industries. These scholars maintain that rather than consuming or interpreting messages as cultural industries intend them to, consumers subvert the messages by interpreting them in ways that are personally meaningful and even beneficial. Thus, they see popular culture as expressing the interests, experiences, and values of ordinary people. Cultural populists argue that popular culture cannot be understood as a culture which is imposed upon the thoughts and actions of people. It cannot be understood unless it is viewed as a genuine expression of the views and values of the common people themselves, rather than as a set of views and values that the culture industry imposes from above. This theoretical approach to popular culture clashes with many of the other approaches that take the view that popular culture is imposed on consumers by social elites and the culture industries they control. To the contrary, say the cultural populists, in their view, popular culture is the authentic culture of the people because it originates with the people themselves. These theorists reject the concept of passive consumption that dominated earlier critical theory described above. By way of contrast, they depict consumers themselves as also producers who give meaning to products such as television shows and advertising in three different ways: semiotic productivity, the making of meaning; enunciative productivity, the articulation of meanings to others; and finally, textual productivity, the creation of new cultural goods. Key to the theory of cultural populists is the concept of audience resistance to hegemonic forms of culture. In their view, consumers make meaning, construct identities, and find pleasures in what they have reshaped from mass culture products. Consumers respond differently to the same form of popular culture, whether it is popular literature, video games, humor, art, music, television, or radio, just to name a few forms of popular culture. Chicana and Chicano scholars such as Américo Paredes, José Limón, Ramón Saldívar, Norma Cantú, Olga Nájera Ramírez, David Maciel, María Herrera Sobek, Nicolás Canelos, Alicia Gaspar de Alba, Tomás Ibarra Frausto, Manuel Peña, Steve Loza, David Reyes, Michelle Abel Payan, Mary Romero, and most recently, Victor Sorrell, generally subscribe to the concept that cultural populists have posited. That is, that the subaltern are not passive and are very capable of constructing their own meanings as a strategy to resist the dominant culture. We're all familiar with Américo Paredes and his groundbreaking work with his pistol in his hand, a border ballad and its hero, published in 1958. 1958, clearly a pioneering work. He studied the corrido of Gregorio Cortés, an early 20th century popular hero among the Mexican-American population of the lower Rio Grande Valley on the Mexican-US border. Paredes demonstrated how heroic corridos, such as the many versions about Cortés, were written anonymously by corridistas who focused on events that clearly reflected the values of their communities. The heroic corrido, then, was a popular culture form that had its origins in a subordinate group, the Mexican-American population in Texas in the early 20th century. And given the places where it was performed, cantinas, birthday parties, festivals, parades, political rallies, and other public community venues, it became a form of popular culture protest on the part of a population that considered itself disenfranchised and exploited. The deep resentment of those present where the corrido was sung over the treatment that Cortés and his family received from Anglo lawmen reflected the unjust acts against the majority of the Mexican-American population in the lower Rio Grande Valley. A popular culture form served to express seething collective resentment and discontent. Paredes believed that this popular culture form was created by Chicanos and Chicanas to resist the hegemonic force of the dominant society. This early study of Chicano popular culture by this eminent Chicano scholar has been influential in shaping a whole generation of scholarly work on popular culture studies and other areas of Chicano cultural expression. Distinguished Chicano scholars José Limón and Ramón Saldívar have more recently reinforced Paredes' very original view that the heroic Mexican corrido is a well-known popular culture form that came into being quite spontaneously from a lower socioeconomic stratum to express collective values, frustration, resistance, and social protest. Limón characterizes this type of corrido as, quote, an expressive instrument of social struggle, end quote. In his analysis of the heroic corrido of Greater Mexico and its transformation into Chicano poetic text of the 1960s, Limón draws on the work of Raymond Williams, specifically his great contribution to culture theory that allows us to see how the subordinate groups are dialectically related to domination in culture terms and how this relationship can be transformed over time. Limón argues that later Chicano and Chicana poetic texts took on much of the status and quality of the residual Mexican culture and remained much of the oppositional character of the early heroic corrido, which waned in popularity from the 1930s to the 1960s, a decade that saw the rise of the Chicano movement and a flowering Florecimiento of literary expression. As Limon's mentor at the University of Texas in Austin, Paredes was instrumental in transmitting knowledge of the Mexican epic corrido to a new generation of scholars and poets who would draw on the contestatory thrust of his poetic song form as a precursor to civil rights era poetics of Chicanos and Chicanas. Ramón Saldívar continues to hold up the legacy and expand on it in his groundbreaking work, Chicano Narrative, published in 1991. But given time constraints, I'm not going to go into that. The Chicano music historian and musicologist Manuel Peña has perceptively documented how Tejano music as a form of expressive culture grew out of a complex combination of historical circumstances surrounding the conflict between Anglo-Texans and Texas Mexicans or Tejanos before and after the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. The Tejanos were at what he aptly calls ground zero in the explosive clash between Anglo and Mexican social systems in the Southwest. Because armed resistance to the oppressive conditions under which Tejanos lived was rarely viable, Tejanos and the wave of Mexican immigrants who later followed, quote, ultimately forged a unique expressive culture ranging from bilingualism to musical forms like the conjunto. Like the corrido, the Texas American conjunto is another powerful oppositional form of popular culture. Later in its history, the conjunto came to reflect the emerging class differences within the Tejano population itself. This uniquely Tejano music form served as a form of resistance against Anglo values and oppressive conditions, as well as a way for working class Tejanos to distinguish themselves from those Tejanos they considered more agregados in their dress, speech, values, customs, and ultimately musical preferences. Music has continued to play a pivotal role in the struggle of Chicanos to both resist cultural assimilation and to carve out a musical identity separate from the dominant mainstream music industry. Our colleague Steve Loza gave us a rather comprehensive overview of contemporary Chicano music yesterday, beginning with Lalo Guerrero, so I'm not going to repeat that here. In fact, I would have cited our colleague Steve Loza and other musicologists such as David Reyes. Spanish language newspapers. As carefully documented by the eminent scholar Nicolás Canelos, Spanish language newspapers in the Southwest and California have been at the forefront in helping to preserve the Spanish language and Mexican and Chicano cultural identity in the face of an Anglo culture that became more aggressive after 1848 in imposing its own values, identity, and language on a militarily conquered people. Particularly from about the mid-1850s to the mid-1900s, the Spanish language press has been an important institution in providing leadership to bring communities together politically and socially for the sponsorship of cultural celebrations, the organization of Spanish language schools and medical clinics, and similar efforts. Newspapers have been leaders in fighting discrimination and racism, especially through the editorial pages and letters to the editor. They have also functioned to promote cultural events in the Spanish-speaking communities and to encourage artistic expression by publishing original poetry and short fiction, or by reprinting poetry or excerpts by works by established Mexican, Spanish, and Latin American authors. Canelos and his colleagues through the Recovery Project have documented that there were upwards of 2,200 Spanish language newspapers that were published all over the Southwest, from Brownsville to San Francisco, between the 1850s and the 1930s or 1940s. Just kind of, as they say in English, blows your mind. I don't know how you translate that. Both the local newspapers and the larger ones are rich sources of political expression in the form of editorials, letters to the editor, news stories, advertisements, and announcements. They are also repositories of artistic expression that often take the form of social commentary, such as the serialized stories of the life and times of the social rebel Joaquin Murrieta, that our colleague referred to yesterday, that appeared in La Gaceta, published in Santa Barbara, California. Much of the poetry published in Spanish language newspapers offered commentary on social issues that directly affected the Chicano population. The Chicano movement of the 1960s and 1970s spawned more than 50 newspapers, some in Spanish only, others in English, and still others in both languages. Chicano student groups, unions, and political and social organizations published these papers in barrios and on college campuses throughout the Southwest and California. These publications of varying length reported political and cultural activities and promoted the different political agendas of their sponsors. Some of the newspapers appeared on a regular basis, others sporadically, depending on the ability of sponsoring groups to finance and staff their production. Celebrations. Eso para anunciar la próxima sección. Gracias.
Perdón, doctor, tenemos 5 minutos más.
Okay. Celebrations. Just as Paredes, Limón and Saldívar have taken the border corrido and established its. Just as Paredes, Limón and Saldívar have taken the border corrido and established it prominently as a form of resistant popular culture. Just briefly, because my time is limited, Norma Cantú and Olga Nájera Ramírez have accomplished the same for Chicano and Chicana lifestyle rituals, children's songs, and games. La Llorona, Indianized Catholicism, mariachi culture, ranchera music, mourning traditions, and regional musical performances. In their invaluable book of edited essays, Chicana Traditions, Continuity, and Change. And I'll leave it at that, because time is running short. In addition to the work of Chicana scholars already mentioned, I would like to comment briefly on 4 very important collections of essays on Chicano and Latino popular culture published in the past 15 years. In the introduction to her edited book, Velvet Barrios, Popular Culture and Chicano Sexualities, published in 2003, Alicia Gaspar de Alba, who is among us, our colleague today, sets forth her definition of popular culture that is expansive to include forms such as rituals and stereotypes, and that other scholars might disqualify from the canon of popular culture forms for pertaining to folklore or subculture. Drawing on forms from the Chicano art movement, she situates Chicana popular culture squarely in the barrio where historically, and continuing into the present working class people have created and sustained their vitality of popular culture practices. I we'll leave it at that to go on to my final comments. Michelle Abel Payan and Mary Romero's book, Latino Popular Culture, argues that, quote, popular culture constitutes a terrain where not only ethnic and racial identity is contested, reproduced, and transformed, but where the struggle for and against social equality is engaged. Drawing on the groundbreaking work of Stuart Hall and by extension Raymond Williams and John Fisk, cultural populists all, they assert that popular culture is the arena of consent and resistance. Most recently, the eminent Chicano art historian Victor Sorel and his co-editor Scott Bow have published a stunning collection of essays and interviews of Chicana and Chicano visual artists, including painters and muralists, curators, filmmakers, santeros, and other sculptors. Their edited anthology is titled Born of Resistance, Cara a Cara Encounters with Chicana Chicano Visual Culture. What is interesting for our purposes today is the editor and contributor's emphasis, as the title signals, on the nature of resistance, which the editors consider, quote, the most contested political, social, and aesthetic concept in Chicana and Chicano arts and cultural studies. They go on to comment, resisting is a singular definition of resistance, and instead drawing on dynamic interplay and complex power relations of resistance, essays consider how Chicana and Chicano visual culture in the 1960s were born of resistance against the dominant forces and authoritative elements of the mainstream, and how in the intervening 5 decades and more, its subversive nature has in practice reconfigured the mainstream, potentially and actually engendering multiculturalism and transnationalism. Traditionally, they say, accompanying the nationalistic paradigm are aesthetic, socioeconomic, political, gender, and spiritual issues that the essays lay bare precisely through their own multi-voice diversity. This book was published in October of this year, 2015. The works of scholars whom I briefly discussed has been essential in revealing how over the past 175 years, Chicanos have used popular culture practices to resist the considerable pressures, economic, educational, electoral, social, exerted on them by mainstream Anglo society to surrender essential aspects of their cultural identity, even as they have continued to be treated as second-class citizens. Consciousness and identity, to finish, are an achievement of collective everyday practices in a context of unequal power relations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Charles. Si les parece bien, vamos a juntar los comentarios y las preguntas de cada expositor hasta el final.